Frames of Reference.
3 films, 2 cinephiles, 1 podcast.
Cinema is my secret passion.
It's a foreign movie. A film is what it is.
But art films make people feel funny.
This film was a personal vision, not a marketing machine.
We're getting too many mainstream movies.
Episode 4, Voyeurism.
Well, hello there.
Well, hello. Long time no see.
Yeah, we are recording these a week apart instead of what is planned as being a normal 2 weeks apart. So it's been a very tight week. But we wanted to get something out for Halloween. And we have an interesting slate of films tonight.
A total reversal from last week.
I love 2 of these movies, and I really enjoy the idea of the third movie.
That's a good way of putting it. And you'd seen all of these before, right?
Yes. Yeah. Honestly, I think I'd seen all of these multiple times. The idea of voyeurism is really on the menu tonight. We're looking at some early proto-slashers from iconic directors with Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock, the most important proto-slasher in a lot of people's books. And almost equally interesting is Michael Powell's Peeping Tom from just a few months prior to Psycho, which a lot of people have kind of underappreciated over the years and how it contributed to the evolution of horror films. And it's a very similar film to Psycho with a lot of consciousness about the images that we as the audience are taking part in and the idea of a desire to observe criminality. And then we're watching a film that borrows a lot of motifs and ideas from these movies. Last Night in Soho by Edgar Wright, which is a fairly recent film that is absolutely in love with the early 60s, the time period in which the other 2 films were made.
Do you want to start with Psycho?
That sounds like a good place to start.
So this movie was directed by Hitchcock, and based off of the book Psycho by Robert Bloch. The screenplay was by Joseph Stefano, and it came out in 1960 and premiered at the DeVille Theater in New York City and stars Anthony Perkins and Jeanette Lee.
It has a 97% on Rotten Tomatoes, has been critically acclaimed since it came out. It was included on both AFI lists of the most important films of the 20th century, and in general is textbook 1960s revolutionary cinema. The film is available on 4K Blu-ray worldwide from Universal and is a wonderful remaster that absolutely blows away prior releases.
So confession, this was my first time watching Psycho. I had not seen it before, and it was also my first time watching the other 2 movies that we're talking about today. So you're a frequent flyer with these, but I am not.
And what did you think?
I really liked them. I can definitely be accused of maybe not reaching for older cinema because I maybe assume that I will not find it as interesting just because I'm, used to more modern films. But I was really engaged by this film. I was not expecting to be as interested in the visual storytelling and also the actual story itself.
Well, it's also we're starting to see the era of auteur cinema with Psycho and Peeping Tom, and we're really getting into films that break the mold of the studio system in the United States.
Yeah.
So in many ways, I think they both feel very contemporary.
They do. They definitely, I remember I was watching Psycho with someone else. I wasn't watching it alone. And we were both like, wow, this is this feels a lot more modern than we were expecting, especially because it is in black and white. So you kind of find yourself thinking it's older than it is. It kind of harkens back, I feel like, to older films in a strange way, even though the cuts and it's shot in a much more modern feeling.
And that's interesting because Hitchcock at the time, it was implied that it was a budgetary thing. But I think it's much more basic, that it looks like a newsreel almost at times.
Yeah, that's actually a really nice description of that. I like that.
Sometimes I have my moments.
It's also super melodramatic.
Yeah. Well, that is Hitchcock. You have a villain, you have a problem, you have a morally dubious primary character. You have all these components that we're very familiar with in the language of Hitchcock movies. And he's coming off this great span of movies, with Vertigo and North by Northwest and these iconic big scope movies. And then Psycho is so intimate and so violent. And you get to embrace the violence up close, and it really revels in the idea of what is a killer, which is something that he hadn't really delved into in that much detail prior. You could say that Rope is a good example because you have the couple in Rope, the 2 guys, I'm going to call them a couple because they are, who are, discussing the idea of murder and what it feels like. There's a lot of like sexual innuendo around what it feels like to kill someone. But in Psycho, we see very close up what it's like to kill someone.
Yeah, and the movie is just extremely intimate. We focus on characters' faces, characters' hands. You participate in most of the movie with the characters.
Yeah, Hitchcock is really interested in how his actors are carrying the scene. There's a lot of attention given to reactions and body language. And I think that's very fresh in the era that this is coming out. We can't remove that this is 1960. The French New Wave is starting to happen in France. We're seeing a rethinking of what acting is on the screen and how intimate it can be and how reactionary and how emotive it can be compared to prior big studio pictures where things were on a much grander scale. Hitchcock is very interested in the little things, the furrowed brow, the tension that you see someone carrying as they're walking into a situation, driving in a car and feeling anxiety because of the way she's looking behind her. All of these are components that really are felt, not said.
Yeah, and so well complemented by the soundtrack. I mean, obviously a lot of the musical portions of Psycho
Bernard
are
Herrmann.
probably, iconic. But like just the way the intensity ratchets up in places, I feel like it really complements the actors' performances.
I find it incredible that in a 5-year span, Bernard Herrmann did The Man Who Knew Too Much, The Wrong Man, Vertigo, North by Northwest, Blue Denim, Journey to the Center of the Earth, Psycho, and Cape Fear.
Some people are just built different.
and then 6 months later, he did The Birds. That is like a repertoire of lifelong... I have several of these albums and play them regularly. These are iconic film scores. I think it says something that in parody to this day, you just play those notes from the shower scene and everyone gets the reference. You don't even need to make the stabbing motion. You don't need to do it. You can just play those notes and everyone understands the reference.
That transcends also like having seen the movie, because I definitely know people in my age group who tend to have not probably seen Psycho still understand the auditory like cue of those strings.
Or the holding a knife above your head, and yeah.
Yeah, like it's there even if you don't know it's there, which is, I feel like I think that would make Hitchcock very happy.
Psycho begins with our hero that we're supposed to believe, Jeanette Lee as Marion Crane, in bed with her clandestine lover, Sam Loomis, played by John Gavin. They're unable to get married because Sam has made some poor financial choices. Marion is a working woman. They're kind of stuck in the trappings of what relationships meant in the early 60s. So their relationship is kind of limited in this limbo of afternoon trysts in a hotel room while away from work. They're not able to just move in together. That would not be socially acceptable. Marion works as a secretary in a real estate office, and upon returning to work after her meeting with Sam, is entrusted with $40,000 cash to deliver to the safety deposit box from a cash purchase. The temptation to have this life-changing amount of money causes her to make a spur-of-the-moment decision in her car, and she starts driving towards Sam's house. Eventually, she pulls over and falls asleep because it's quite a long drive, and is woken up and asked questions by a police officer. He takes an interest in how anxious she is. She becomes anxious over the police officer's interest and believes that people are coming after her. She has a real guilt sense about the crime, so she quickly trades her car in at a dealership and basically goes on the run.
So the tension increases, and as Marion continues on the run, she stops off at the secluded Bates Motel, which is attended to by one sole proprietor, Norman Bates, who is a soft-spoken, friendly, quiet young man. And they strike up kind of a bit of a friendship, or at least friendly conversation, over dinner, which he brings to her from a very foreboding house that is backlit behind the motel. During this conversation, they get very philosophical, and eventually the conversation ends with Marion deciding that she must return back to her life. She has to return the money. She has to go back because she is afraid. She is very uncomfortable when talking with Bates about the prisons that we build in our own lives with one another. He's imprisoned seemingly by his mother, who he gets very agitated when Marion suggests that he goes and lives a life of his own. And Marion is trapped by her situation where she doesn't have a lot of money and can't get married to the person she loves.
He's also financially imprisoned by the fact that his mother's husband, who is now deceased, we'll learn more about that later, bought a hotel that then got bypassed by the interstate system a few years later. So he's stuck.
Yes, that's an important detail. The Bates Motel is not a thriving business. It's this very
It's in California near the Arizona border. And you get a vibe that this is basically right off like a Route 66 situation where the interstate just utterly devastated the small towns along the route.
Yeah. And it's in this conversation that Marion kind of starts to pick up that something is not quite right. She suggests to Norman that he should not feel imprisoned by his mother and should perhaps pursue a life outside of her. And that is when Norman goes from being a gentle, soft-spoken, friendly person to showing a darker side, a more angry side that is very possessive. And Marion immediately picks up on the danger. She excuses herself and retires for the night. She tries to figure out how she's going to get out of the situation she has gotten herself into. At this point, she has interacted with law enforcement, swapped out a car, and been away from home for long enough that people are definitely looking for her. She's also spent about $700, I think it was, of the $40,000, which is nothing to sneeze at, even though out of $40,000, it might not seem like that much, but she certainly won't be able to make up that sum in return. She goes to throw away some of the writings that she did in her checkbook, trying to balance things out, and then decides to take a shower, presumably to relax. Going back to our theme about voyeurism, it is good to note here that Bates does look through a peephole into her room, and that, again, heightens to the viewer that all is not well here. She's not going to be leaving this hotel.
There's also a peephole into the bathroom.
Yes.
These are constructed systems for him to be a peeping Tom.
He's been here a while.
And then we reach the most infamous part of Psycho. Bates enters her room while she is in the shower and violently stabs her many, many times, and then hides her body in her car and sinks her car in the swamp. It feels trite to describe this scene, as almost everyone is on some level aware of this moment, either through the original film or through parody. This is one of these moments of pop culture that just reaches everywhere. Obviously, when someone disappears, questions start being asked, especially when they disappear with a large amount of cash. Marion's sister begins asking Sam about the theft and trying to figure out if he knows something. A private investigator named Arbogast, who's been hired by her employer, enters the scene and joins up with Marion's sister Lila and Sam, trying to figure out what's happened. He eventually winds up at the Bates Motel and questions Norman, who repeatedly deceives him during an interview and is genuinely nervous. So he's an individual who is professionally experienced with people's reactions and suspects much from Norman. He's able to find that Marion signed the guest register under a false name and is continually poking around with a number of questions about the fact that Marion had apparently spoken to Norman's mother. As soon as Norman's mother enters the conversation, he kind of shuts down and denies Arbogast any further investigation. So without permission, Arbogast enters the Bates home, the scary-looking house on the hill, to find Norman's mother and ask himself. A shadowy figure emerges, and we see him stabbed suddenly in an iconic sequence with him falling down the steps.
Upon Arbogast not returning, Lila and Sam get agitated, and they go to see Al Chambers, who is the deputy sheriff in town. He is not appreciative of a late-night visit from these two, but he hears them out as they describe all that has basically happened, including the money, Marion's disappearance, and now Arbogast's. At first, the sheriff sort of talks about various other reasons for Arbogast not showing up, implying that maybe he found other clues that had taken him away from the Bates Motel. But eventually, it comes out in the conversation that Norman Bates' mother, who up until this point has been a huge character in question, the narrative has revolved around a conversation with her that has yet not happened, but we want to meet her. We want to talk to her. Turns out she's dead and has been dead for a while. Mrs. Chambers, who is also there, adds that Norman found the bodies of his mother and a man that she'd been having an affair with. Sam, however, is really confused by this because originally Sam did go to the Bates Motel to do like a quick reconnaissance. He couldn't find Bates because Bates was getting rid of Arbogast's body, so he missed Bates, but he saw a silhouette in the window, which adds to the idea that Mrs. Bates was still alive at this point. But now in a conversation with Chambers, it's revealed that she's in fact dead, causing confusion for Sam and Chambers to basically be like, you definitely did not see that. Meanwhile, we are then shown a clip at the house where Norman carries his protesting mother to the fruit cellar to hide her from visitors because he knows that more people are going to follow. Now, Marion and Arbogast have both gone missing in connection with the motel. He knows that others are coming. So this is once again kind of maybe alluding to the viewer that maybe she's actually not dead and she's actually been alive this whole time or something like that. No one's face is shown, and it's just purely a conversation that you never really see face to face.
Actually, we just see a shot of the house, right?
You overhear the conversation. Norman's like talking with his mother and she's talking back. She's protesting. And then it shows an overhead shot of Bates exiting his mother's bedroom with something in his arms, a body.
Yeah.
So then Lila and Sam really do decide to take matters into their own hands. So they check into the base motel as a pretext that they are a husband and a wife who are passing through. Bates is actually there this time and greets them. They check in for a room. He places them in a room that is almost the opposite of the room Marion checks into. He chooses to have them, I think, in one of the way further off rooms. And basically, Lila and Sam check in. They have a thinly veiled conversation with Bates, but it's mostly just pleasantries. Lila and Sam get over to their room. They make a plan. Sam is going to distract Bates while Lila sneaks into the house to speak to Mrs. Bates, because they're still convinced at this point that she's still alive.
So they do that. Lila enters the home while Sam tries to distract Norman. Norman sees through this, becomes suspicious, and knocks Sam out and chases up to the home. Lila hears him coming and hides in the fruit cellar, which is where she discovers Norman's mother is. However, Norman's mother has been dead for quite a long time. In fact, she is a mummified corpse. She screams in horror. Norman chases after her, is about to attack her with his knife when Sam saves the day and subdues him. We wrap up after this at a police station where a psychiatrist explains that Norman killed his mother and her lover 10 years earlier out of jealousy for the attention that she was giving her lover. But then he felt so much guilt that he mummified her corpse and began to act as if she was still alive. He recreated his mother as an alternate personality. In fact, using the terms of the era, they go out of their way to say that he is not transgender. He is simply a man attracted to women who has an alternate personality, which is that of his mother, a woman. He has killed other women before. There is a pattern of behavior. And at this point, because of the events that have happened, his mother's personality has become the dominant personality so that Norman is not even recognizable. We end with the morality ending of him sitting in jail, waiting his sentence as his mother is giving an inner monologue to him that the murders were all his fault. And that is our movie.
So it would be remiss to talk about Psycho without talking about the morality aspect of this movie, both when it came out and also how it had to adhere to the Hays Code and the ways that it kind of pushes the envelope on that. I was kind of surprised because the movie came out in 1960 and I knew it was going to be a slasher and a thriller, but at the same time, I was kind of surprised what they actually managed to get away with in this movie for the time.
The movie was intensely critiqued by the MPAA during its rating process. And we're starting to see the cracks in the armor of the Hays Code. This is really, 1960 is really the last year where the Hays Code had a lot of power over cinema. It existed for almost another decade, but you start to see things get a lot looser in this time period. It's interesting, in a film that revolves so much around violence, the Hays Code objections were almost all around sexuality. From the opening moments of the film, we see non-married lovers in bed with Marianne in just a bra. Under the Hays Code, we're not even supposed to see unmarried couples in the same bed, let alone the idea of someone being nude. We don't see any genitalia or breasts, but nude in a shower immediately after having flushed a toilet, which was controversial for the time. Not with any bodily elements in it, literally just paper, but still a first. We see her in the shower where she's violently stabbed by a man who is peeping on her in the shower. That was very groundbreaking in American cinema at the time. There is no nudity throughout this entire sequence, though the censors swear it up and down that they could see it. It's really a remarkable work of editing. There's an entire documentary about this that came out a few years ago. The editing is so frenetic as it conveys not only the action of the stabbing, but also manages to show a lot of her body without showing anything that would not have been acceptable at the time. So it struggled with its reputation despite being allowed to be released. It was further censored in Britain and most of the rest of the world. It was banned in, I believe, Ireland and Italy for quite some time. This is really the final gasp of the Hays Code as you're starting to see more and more transgressive cinema throughout the 60s. This is a big director throwing his weight around to get what he wants on screen with as few compromises as possible. The other aspect of censorship in this movie is homosexuality. Perkins, it was rumored at the time, and we know this now, Anthony Perkins was a gay actor playing a character who is incredibly effeminate and gay-coded. And Hitchcock had already struggled with censorship on Rope, a film which revolves around a presumably homosexual couple in the 1940s. It's insane to me that Rope was made in the 40s. So we have ideas about gender throughout this movie and gender nonconformity and cross-dressing and personalities that a man can have that are not of a man, that are handled with the language of the era, but also just putting them on screen is pushing the envelope. And all of this is viewed through a lens of a voyeuristic interest in the idea of psychology and psychopathy and what makes people tick.
I do think it is also worth mentioning, just because with the Hays Code, obviously not a thing adhered to now, and there's all sorts of ways that movies benefit now from transgressive cinema of the 60s. I think it's very worth pointing out that characters who commit crimes in this movie, things don't go well for them. Marion dies, even though she repents of what she's done.
Yep.
She does not get any redemption. Pretty much any transgressive acts taken over the course of the movie, the character does suffer a consequence for it.
Hitchcock loved morality plays, but that's also in some ways a nod to the Hays Code. No sinful character gets out scot-free. You know, Norman receives the traditional, presumably institutional sentence, and Marion dies. Those are the outcomes. Even our investigator, who is a bit of a shady character, we can kind of get the vibe, dies. The innocents in the story, her sister and her boyfriend, are the only ones to escape.
I do think it's very interesting how I've been thinking about this with really just with Peeping Tom and with Psycho, but the way psychiatrists are portrayed as being like the all-knowing solutions.
Especially in the 1960s.
And I noticed that in a sitcom I was watching the other day as well, where like they brought on a psychologist onto the show who just had all the answers to this character's problems. And I was like, wow, just magic. The sitcom was from the 70s, and I was like, how would you know that? How would you know that about that person? It was MASH. Yeah.
Hitchcock is obsessed with Freud and psychoanalysis throughout many of his films. But Psycho really starts to play with ideas about gender that he hasn't really been able to go this in depth on prior to this. We have very clear-cut roles defined by gender that characters are pushing back against. And that is not socially acceptable. And he's exploring the idea of people who don't play by the rules of society. And he connects that to criminality, which is a interesting glimpse into that era.
Overall, this movie surprised me in that the premise is actually like pretty simple, in the sense that we meet a character meets end, and the rest of the film is just a couple more characters putting together very few pieces of information to come away with the big picture. But despite the fact that it's a very simple, straightforward story with not that many characters, it still like delivers really well on its moments that it builds up to. And the ending,
the twists are justified.
The twists are justified, and it felt like an earned ending. I wasn't like bored by the ending, even though I knew where everything was going, because it was Psycho, and who doesn't know, you know.
I'm always surprised at how quickly it wraps itself up, though.
It does. It's
like under 10 minutes from the attack on Marion's sister to the end of the movie. The entire aftermath. We don't need this. It's not important. Hitchcock doesn't spend time on it because it's not important. We get the explanation, and then we get the end credits roll.
From the magic psychiatrist. He shows up.
Yes.
He's like, here you go, your solutions. End credits.
And then the police officer believe him on face value. I do think it's interesting. One of the most talked about things of this movie is that it had a massive star in Jeanette Leigh, and she's killed in the second reel of the movie. That was unheard of at the time. We see this done occasionally today. The biggest example I can think of is Scream killing Drew Barrymore in the first few minutes. But Hitchcock obsessed the entire idea about what a movie star is. In a movie that is in many ways about culture and desire and obsession, he throws out the leading lady of the movie in the first third of the movie. So at that point, the audience knows that all bets are off, especially in the 1960s.
Yeah, which is really interesting because right up until that moment, everything is so deeply focused on Marion. And then she's suddenly just removed from the story and things just kind of spin out from there. Which I was actually surprised by that because I knew the iconic shower scene, but I didn't know when it happened in the movie. And I was really surprised when it came up as early as it did. I was like, oh, she's gone. Okay.
Yeah, picking up the pieces now.
Yeah. And at the time, like, I was struck by how there's an unsettling quality to how Bates just cleans up the murder scene. At this time, the viewer is
incredibly
led to believe,
detached.
Yeah, so detached. The viewer is led to believe, at this point that it's his mother who's killed her, even though, you've got the undertone and it's been foreshadowed that he's actually the killer. He goes about cleaning this crime scene so effectively that you are left knowing that he has cleaned a crime scene before. And there's something so menacing about that. He doesn't say anything. He just very mechanically puts everything away. And he has a very plot convenient bog behind the motel to get rid of everyone's evidence.
Tar pit, actually.
Tar pit. My bad.
Yeah, it's in Southern California. It's a tar pit.
You're so right. It would not be a bog.
But also, just 10 minutes prior to that, you're able to get a sense that he's a violent person just in his body language when he starts to meet pushback from Marion.
Yeah, like the way that he fills up the screen suddenly in a way that he hasn't before, you know that she's in danger.
Marion is framed in a diminutive position immediately as he's threatening her, essentially.
Yeah, that immediate power shift in the room, which makes it for me like one of the more memorable scenes in the film. Danger's there. Something bad is going to happen, even though she excuses herself from the conversation and makes like she's going to escape. She doesn't. And she goes right into the room where she eventually dies.
We also in that moment immediately know that she is a woman alone with just a man and his sickly mother. And we've established that the nearest town is quite a few miles away. They're really isolated, and that power dynamic becomes incredibly palpable in that scene leading up to her murder.
So to switch gears, let's move into our next film. Peeping Tom also includes murder and voyeurism and all those things we basically just discussed, but in a different way. This movie was directed by Michael Powell,
who was really a gem of British cinema in this time. He directed The Red Shoes, a number of other iconic movies in the 40s and early 50s. So this was a big departure from him. It was written by Leo Marks, who was a British cryptographer and after the war took up playwriting and eventually wrote this screenplay. And Carl Bohm, who some might know from Fassbender's cinema, such as Fox and His Friends, with Anna Massey and Moira Shearer. The film, while critically panned on initial release, has entered into cinema lore and today holds a Rotten Tomatoes score of 95%. There is a new 4K restoration coming out in the UK in January from Studio Canal. I would not recommend buying their previous release because of heavy digital noise reduction and some other source flaws. But those who have seen the new restoration have said it's quite glorious. And it is unavailable in the US outside of an out-of-print DVD from Criterion. So go import that, folks. Remember, a 4K disc is region-free.
This is so... While the themes are very similar to Psycho, it's such a different movie from Psycho.
So our movie starts in London, in the Soho district of London, with Mark Lewis, who is a young camera assistant living in a home which he owns. That was his father's home, a famed psychiatrist, as we learn. In the very first scene, Mark meets with a prostitute, covertly filming her from a camera which he has hidden under his coat. And from the point of view of the camera, we see him meet up with this woman, go to her flat, exchange all the niceties one would usually have with a prostitute upon meeting them, and then brutally murder her with a knife attached to the end of his camera tripod. We cut to him viewing this film with great interest in his personal darkroom, and the next morning he goes about his life as a camera assistant at a local movie studio as police begin to investigate and discover the murder. He returns to the scene of the crime to film the crime scene and is noticed by the police, where he identifies himself as a reporter for a local paper. So we get a whole bunch of glimpses of Mark's life. We see a little bit about the studio system. We see him photographing softcore pinup pornography above a local pharmacist. He is shy, reclusive, effeminate, hardly socializes, is very queer-coded, but also very much a caricature of how we perceive someone who is a serial killer. He is awkward, is constantly feels out of his own skin and kind of wanders through life in a very detached way. One of his tenants, who at first we presume are his fellow tenants, not knowing that he owns the building, is young Helen Stevens, a very sweet, slightly naive young woman living with her blind mother. They take up a friendship after she sees him spying on her 21st birthday party through a window. Whew. Through time, we start to see this friendship build, and it gets revealed that his father took home movies of him as a child while he was a non-consenting component in his father's experiments on fear and the nervous system in the human child and child development. We see a whole bunch of trauma, such as lizards being thrown on his bed and shining lights in his eyes while he was sleeping. And, the kinds of experiments which modern psychology has just ethically banned for many, many decades, but his father clearly violated. We even see something as intimate as his reaction to his mother's death on the deathbed. He explains to Helen that the entire home was wired for sound, and he was under constant surveillance. He developed unable to express himself without his father observing and reacting. So things continue. There is a young stand-in, which is a movie studio term for the person who stands in place of an actor while the lighting and focus measurements are taken, who Mark has begun to develop a bit of an affection for. After the set is closed for the day, they stay on the soundstage under the guise of it being a date. They fool around a bit, have some fun, and then his camera starts rolling as he's trying to make what he describes as the perfect movie, and she dies the same fate of the prostitute in the first scene. Upon her body being discovered the next day, police are able to connect what they believe to be a serial killer. There's intense interviews throughout the entire studio. There's a lot of suspicion, but Mark believes he's a cool cucumber and even does a passable job at keeping appearances as he's followed by police. He goes on a date with Helen where he leaves his camera behind and starts to have like a normal life. He briefly kisses her, and we start to see that he could solve his problems and become and experience a normal relationship. Upon returning from the date, he goes up to his room, and Helen's mother has worked her way up into his dark room and is waiting for him to confront him. Unable to keep up the charade, and because Helen's mother is blind, he starts screening his snuff films. And just from his reaction and voice, she's disturbed by what she sees in him. She tells him that she's uncomfortable and does not want Helen to see him anymore. Mark reassures her that he will never photograph Helen. At this point, the police have brought in a psychologist to the studio investigation, a colleague of Mark's father's, and they strike up a conversation about the psychological phenomenon of voyeurism and peeping toms. This is our first real language where the film kind of breaks that fourth wall and acknowledges that what he's doing is not natural. After this interaction, his police tail witnesses him going up to photograph pinup models at the shop. When he emerges later, they know that everything's good because he's returning home. Police leave. The next morning, the model's body is discovered in the shop. At this point, the police know it's him. So we reach our final act. Helen enters Mark's darkroom and finally decides to watch one of his films. She learns the real truth, that he is making snuff films and he has murdered multiple people, and obviously is very upset, goes to flee the room, and that is when Mark catches her and starts to talk about how he's obsessed with the fear in his victims' eyes. He actually built a contraption of putting a mirror on the camera so that his victims are seeing their own reaction as they are murdered. He threatens Helen but is unable to kill her as the police arrive, and he realizes he's cornered. He then dies by suicide with his own knife, and his camera still running, capturing his death. Actually, multiple cameras staged throughout the room capturing his death, completing this film he's been working on, and Helen sobs over his dead body as the police enter the room and observe the scene.
So this movie is a really, in many ways, quite a strong contrast to Psycho in that it feels much more realistic, and in being so, feels much more insidious. It's far less likely that you're going to go to a random secluded motel and get stabbed to death, but being either peeped on, stalked on, or killed just going about your daily life is a little more realistic and a little more grounded. So I think that kind of adds to a bit more, I don't know, scariness of this movie.
And there's also like a sexual politics angle of it, of we have, we start off with a prostitute being murdered. Then we have someone who is clearly desiring to be the kind of sex kitten movie star that was taking over at the time. In contrast to that, we have Helen, who is portrayed as very naive, very pure, and Mark doesn't want to kill her. So there's a bit of a morality tale aspect to this, which is a little uncomfortable.
So there's a lot of layers in the voyeurism angle for this movie, especially because while all three of these movies do have a voyeuristic theme, Peeping Tom has a little bit more happening when you think about it, because the movie itself is about a filmmaker who is seeking out to make the perfect film, his fascination, which is fear. So he is shown throughout the movie, both working on making his movie and also viewing his own movies in a way that the audience kind of parodies the audience act of watching the movie. So in a way, we are being forced to participate in the voyeuristic angle of these movies. It's directly commentating on film. It's directly commentating on exploitation and of body and of women. And then we in the movie theater watching this movie are participating in that exploitation.
It's also commenting on the larger culture around movies. It's no coincidence that he works at a movie studio where we see a lot of vanity. We see a lot of vapid movie choices that are made because the movie system is a machine that's designed to turn out a product which the consumers consume. And I don't think that's a mistake when we look at the larger message here about what are we consuming when we watch things. I do think it distinguishes itself from Psycho also in that not only do we see these murders happen in a perspective where we are consciously a viewer, but it also doesn't cut. It does not cut in the lead up to the murders. Psycho famously has dozens and dozens and dozens of cuts in the murder sequence. Here, we see the prelude. We see, without cutting, the shot multiple times of him walking up to the victim, their reaction, them knowing what's going to happen, and then the stabbing. The movie doesn't look away from the violence. It embraces the violence, and it therefore forces us to embrace the violence.
Yeah, and in doing so, like following again on forcing the viewer to participate in the violence, this movie very closely follows pretty much every step of the killer's life. In Psycho, we follow the victim's perspective for large portions of the movie, and even though we do have scenes where it's just Bates talking to his mother or to himself, however you want to interpret that, they're very detached scenes. You're not participating with the discussions that he has. Whereas in Peeping Tom, we follow Mark pretty much the entire time. We see things from his perspective, and in a way, you are kind of rooting for him.
Oh, he's a very sympathetic character.
Even though he's killing people. Like, there's a scene where he is, like, talking to the police officer, and part of me is like, no, like, don't give yourself away. And then I was like, what am I doing? This man is a serial killer. He needs to be stopped.
It reminds me of Nabokov's Lolita in the way that we are seeing things from the perspective of someone who is doing heinous, heinous crimes, but they are charming and endearing and sympathetic, and therefore we start to associate with the crimes, which is incredibly uncomfortable. The film also, in contrast to Psycho, takes a very gritty, realist look at London. The movie feels less contrived than Psycho. It feels natural and kitchen sink in the way that we're able to connect with the lives and experiences of all the characters. So that adds a real edge because this feels like something ripped from the headlines that could actually happen.
Yeah, following in Peeping Tom, characters are going about their regular lives, living in their regular situations. Whereas in Psycho, also Psycho being more heightened and more like theatrical and dramatic. But in Psycho, pretty much everybody who is there, with the exception of Bates, is in a new situation that they've never been in before. They're visiting the Bates Motel. They are passing through. The only person who really belongs there is Bates himself. And so the kind of lived-in quality that Peeping Tom has, is a little more, way more actually down to earth with the real world. But the characters are all existing in their natural habitat, so to speak.
The film's also in color, which allows us to connect more realistically with the experience, unlike Psycho, which made a very intentional and odd choice in 1960 to film in black and white for arguably reasons of practicality, but it also creates a very dramatic aesthetic that allows us to further distance itself from reality.
It's like Psycho happened somewhere out there, and Peeping Tom has happened, very specifically in London, in the Soho district.
Like Psycho feels consistently like it's the Southwest, and just by the landmarks, but it feels like it could be anywhere. Peeping Tom, exactly where this happened. If you know London, you can identify landmarks throughout it. You have a real sense that these are real people working in real situations, and that makes it much scarier, in my opinion.
Yeah. So going back to Freudism, psychology, an even bigger theme in this movie, arguably, a character's father is literally a psychologist who is doing research on fear that heavily impacts the protagonist. And then you additionally have the almost bookendedness of him meeting a colleague of his father at the end of the movie, asking about if there's a cure to being a peeping Tom. The themes of psychology, psychosis, and Freudism is just very much more explicit, I feel like, in this movie than it is even in Psycho. And
the psychologist is almost flippant in saying, oh yeah, in a couple of sessions we could have a peeping Tom, and they never mentions that he's a peeping Tom. We could have a peeping Tom cured in a matter of weeks. But at that point, Mark is in too deep. He's murdered multiple people. He's not redeemable. So that's not an option for him anymore.
Yeah, and for almost a second, you kind of wonder if he's looking for redemption. Is there a redemption? What could his life have been? Mm-hmm. But then you are left with the fact that he is in too deep. He can't get out of the situation.
He's also continuously re-traumatizing himself by reviewing his father's film footage of his research. He's obsessed with his father in many ways while also fearing his father. Also, like Psycho, Mark is effeminate and shy and engages in a lot of the mid-century tropes which would be associated with a homosexual.
In addition to being a killer, he is coded in a lot of ways as a gay character. And going back to morality again, this is like an unfortunate aspect of 60s cinema and cinema from the era, which is where, a character who is Killer gaze. It's the trope. It's there, very plainly there.
Which, like, he's clearly infatuated with women, but he also presents with, as you said, the telltale tropes of the effeminate, quiet, soft-spoken, nervous character that would allow an audience to see a gay lens.
Yeah, rebuking qualities that are not seen as gender conforming almost, or typical for the male gender. So there's that aspect of the movie as well. It did come out in the 60s, but when talking about both these movies, it's important to point out the fact that you do have the killer gaze trope active.
Yeah. Karl Böhm also featured in a ton of iconic queer cinema in Germany in the 70s under Fassbinder. So while he was not gay himself, there is a connection there in the history of queer cinema.
Yeah, I think one thing that is really interesting between these two movies is the radically different receptions that they received, despite the fact that they came out around the same time, basically months apart. One was lauded as being, like Psycho specifically, was lauded as being an immediate classic, well-loved, well-received, and by critics and by audience pretty much alike. I mean, obviously you have morality critics or sensitivity critics, but it did very, very well. And that is not what happened to Peeping Tom.
Peeping Tom ruined the career of basically everyone behind it. Critics reviled it. It was an instant flop in the UK. It barely released in the US under basically an art house brand because of the Hays Code. It could not be distributed by a major studio. It was treated as something gross and vulgar, and it was basically viewed as a B movie, something not to be considered highbrow, something not to be looked at with much intrigue, despite coming from an iconic director. So you don't really start to see critical appreciation for Peeping Tom until about a decade later, when Martin Scorsese and a bunch of the film school brat generation really reassess it and properly contextualize it among the other films of the era as being the groundbreaking masterpiece that it is. It was also heavily censored. It was unavailable on home video in the UK until the 90s. It was censored throughout Europe. It was banned in Italy. It was banned in Ireland. It was very difficult to get in the US for a long time. It did not play widely. So that's an aspect of Psycho did its best to use misdirection to get past censors. Peeping Tom doesn't care. Peeping Tom, you have full nudity. You have incredibly violent acts. It is unflinching in portraying just how vile these people are.
Yeah, and the narrative doesn't try to morally condemn. It just sort of has you are a fly on the wall, voyeuristically observing these very real people living these lives.
Even in an early scene, one of Mark's side hustles is pornography. And even in an early scene, we see this extended conversation of a man purchasing his work in the drugstore as a schoolgirl comes in and buys sweets next to him. And it makes no real judgment on the man other than to show that culture is uncomfortable with the idea of pornography.
Overall, I think the pacing of this movie is very interesting because it's not a super long movie, but
It's very tight. It's under 90 minutes.
Yeah, under 90 minutes. It doesn't feel like it needed to.
It's 100 minutes.
100 minutes?
Yeah.
I feel like it was very very steady. It was not the same dramatic flair that Psycho had, but I was really engaged by this movie, like beginning to end. And I found myself like being surprised when I got to the end. I was like, oh, it's over.
It ends very, very abruptly. It also doesn't feel like Michael Powell's other work. It feels very reactionary to, we're coming a year after something like The 400 Blows by Francois Truffaut. It feels naturalistic in a way that we wouldn't have expected from the era in British cinema. This film is such a departure for Powell, while Psycho just feels like the chronological evolution of Hitchcock's work throughout the 50s.
And with that, I guess we better move into our last movie of this episode, which is Last Night in Soho. So fast forward to the future. The year is 2021. And Edgar Wright directs this movie, and it was co-written by Wright and Christy Wilson Cairn. This movie stars Thomasin McKenzie, Anya Taylor-Joy, Matt Smith, and Diana Rigg. It's
Diana Rigg's last performance, and she really delivers a spectacle here. All of the screen presence that anyone who has seen The Avengers and her other iconic work of the 60s and 70s can really imagine the presence that she was in cinema and how brutally her loss was felt. Rotten Tomatoes holds it at 75%, and if you actually dig into reading those reviews, critics were very divided on it. It premiered at Venice and had a wide theatrical release just a few weeks later, and is available worldwide from Universal on 4K Blu-ray.
So hopping into a quick summary of this movie, in some ways I feel like this is almost an easier movie to summarize because Psycho and Peeping Tom have a very classic, like, figuring out the mystery kind of tight plot line, whereas this movie is a little more loosey-goose, in my opinion, with the plot, but I'm here for it. So the story opens up following Eloise, or Ellie Turner, who is this teenager who is just gotten into the, I believe it's the London School of Fashion. She wants to be a designer. Our first scene with her is her dancing to music and singing in what I would call the most structurally integral piece of newspaper that I've ever seen. I was waiting for that dress to like rip or something, but no, it holds true. She's dancing around the room. She's singing these 60s hits, and she is leaving home. Her maternal grandmother who raised her is showing anxiety about her leaving home, but in some ways showing a little bit more than maybe would be normal, because it's revealed later on that it's revealed in the moment that Ellie sees her dead mother, just to like rip that Band-Aid off.
In the mirror.
Just in the mirror, just right there. And
unremarked on.
Yeah, it's just, she's just a part of Ellie's life. Ellie's not shocked to see her there. And also it is shown later on that her grandmother knows about the fact that Ellie has this connection, can see her own mother in the mirror, and also has this ability to, as is revealed later on, visit people's pasts if she is in their vicinity, or either it's not clear if she's near the person or if it's in the place. She knows that her mother also wanted to be a big designer and was not able to make it. We don't really know what happened to the mother. We don't know if she became overwhelmed with the life of a designer, or if there's something more insidious about her own like mental abilities. That's not made totally clear. But we follow Ellie from Cornwall to London. Bit of a contrast for her. She's in for a culture shock. She kind of goes from being like a big fish in a small pond to being a small fish in a very large London-sized pond. She meets her roommate, who at first we're like, are they going to be friends? And the narrative immediately is like, no, she's going to be the outcast. She tries to fit in. She finds that school is not all that she hoped it would be. She does not quite fit in with her friends. She is the odd one out. So she decides to move out of her School provided housing and decides to get her own rooms. So she moves to this house that is extremely similar to harkens back to the house that we see in Peeping Tom, where Mark lives. She then goes to bed for her first night, where she's in her new rooms. To clarify, her roommate was having people over, making it very difficult for her to like get into schoolwork and things like that. So there you have sympathies with the reason that Ellie decides to move out of her school housing. She's not fitting in, and also she's having a really hard time getting any kind of rest or study done.
We've all had the roommate who has really loud sex, you know?
So she moves into this new room with a, not unfriendly landlady. She's very strict. She lays down the rules. Don't bring back boys. Don't be too loud. And also I need 2 months of rent in advance because people tend to leave here. And Ellie's like, I'm going to make it work. She goes to sleep for the night, and it is revealed that she can visit the past in her dreams. She's not literally in the past, but she is able to see what has taken place in the past. And she goes back to 1963. She isn't literally in 1963, but she sort of inhabits the body / sees things from the perspective of Sandy, who is this young woman who has come to London to make her career as a singer. She wants to be a performer. Ellie is not seemingly shocked by all of this, which kind of leads you to wonder as a viewer if she has done this before, if she's seen other people's pasts through her dreams.
But she's also been obsessed with the 60s from just seeing her room. So she's absolutely loving this as well. The glamour of Soho in 1963. This is really her dream. The cars, the signs, the movie premieres, the music. She isn't everything she wanted, but things start to unravel.
Yeah, so she follows Sandy, who meets this guy named Jack, who basically tells her that he can help her figure out her career. For the first few nights where Ellie dreams, she follows them falling in love, so to speak, with each other. From Ellie's perspective, at least, Jack is going to help Sandy get the dream life as a star that she has come to London for. And so the first few days and nights shows Ellie, dreaming about Sandy and Jack's life, Sandy doing an audition, singing. It features a lot of really beautiful dresses, and it's a very glamorous, dramatic, beautiful visuals.
And it's really interesting that we see the entire thing from the perspective of we can see Ellie in all the reflections. So we're able to watch her reactions and her just drink this all in.
Yeah, the line between Ellie and Sandy is like a very thin line, but it is still a distinct one where Ellie observes but also participates in what is taking place in these dreams. And Ellie in real life starts to model things after Sandy. In a way, Sandy is everything that Ellie is obsessed with, at least to begin with. Ellie changes her hair to be a blonde, like 60s with bangs, blowout kind of style that Sandy is rocking in this movie. And she starts to do her makeup more heavily, starts to kind of push away what one would consider more country aspects of herself. She doesn't dress in her like homemade clothes that she brought from Cornwall. And again, drastically is just sort of trying to embody what she envies about Sandy.
She spends way out of her budget on vintage clothes, for one thing.
Yeah, she spends like over 300 pounds on a vintage jacket that Sandy is shown to wear in a dream, and then realizes that she has to get a job if she's going to, support this new obsession of hers. So she gets a job at a pub that she visited previously in the movie. What's an important detail here as well to note is that Ellie starts to see places that she has now seen in her dreams. She sees the Rialto Theater where Sandy gets hired, and she also starts to recognize areas where she has visited as Sandy, but not as Ellie. Things start to unravel, though. Ellie goes to sleep thinking that she's going to have a wonderful night following the dreamy, glamorous career of Sandy. And she comes to find that Jack is actually a pimp and that basically has turned or forced Sandy into being a sex worker, basically telling her that this is what she has to do in order to get the life that she wants. He's not ever really been invested in helping Sandy become a big star. He's only been interested in how he can use Sandy. And so these dream sequences get much darker, scarier, and Ellie tries to exit the dreams but can't. It's important to note that throughout the movie, but especially kind of crushing in here, that most interactions that Ellie has with men in this movie shows them as, from her perspective, as being taller, looming, menacing, and dangerous. Anytime she bumps into a guy in the street, the very first man she speaks to when she arrives in London creeps her out pretty significantly, which, to be fair, he was creepy.
Yeah.
She was very legitimate in her concerns with him, basically making a joke about being her stalker. But the crushingness of these like tall male figures kind of start to seep into her day to day. Ellie starts to be haunted by the men that Sandy has slept with. That's kind of where the more horror thriller aspect starts to creep in, and Ellie's grip on reality starts to slide. She is haunted by what Sandy has been through, and Sandy, who continually tries to get out of this life, can't. She's stuck. So Ellie starts to have like hallucinations, basically. These terrifying, ghostly figures of these men that Sandy has basically been forced into having sex with. And she's terrified by it. She starts to have trouble with her school. She starts to have trouble, you know, even having normal human interactions with other people. At this point, there's this man, silver-haired man, who's cropped up a couple times before in the movie, who both she and like we as the viewer are sort of led to believe that this is Jack, but a much older Jack. But she doesn't really confront him about it. But when she starts changing her appearance to look more like Sandy, he does start taking notice of her. He comments that she looks strangely familiar. He asks her if she smokes. Well, Sandy smokes in many of the dream sequences that Ellie has had about her. He recognizes the white jacket that Ellie is sporting, it seems, which again really does lend into the idea that this is Jack. And it adds a more menacing edge to every interaction that Ellie has with him. So things kind of come to a head where Ellie is afraid to go to sleep. She is terrified by these visions that she's seeing. And she is asked by John, who is this other student who's been really friendly with her up until this point, but they haven't really had an in-depth conversation with one another. They've just sort of passed each other in class and at parties. John invites her to a Halloween party.
John also has class solidarity as being someone who's clearly not from the posh background of a lot of their classmates. He's also a person of color. He's a black man.
They have this more common ground, and it's interesting that the narrative sort of implies that they're gonna like get together / be friends, but then like things happen with Ellie where she kind of gets in her own way and they're not able to come together in any way, either in trying to solve this mystery that's basically kind of unraveling before her eyes, or in even forming like an actual beneficial friendship that would have helped her grow in her fashion school life. So they go to this Halloween party. They have a great time to begin with, but then once again, the terrifying figures from her dreams start to creep into reality. So Ellie runs out of the party, try and get some air.
This all happens after the mean girl who was her former roommate handed her a drink. So the viewer is left to question whether she was dosed.
We are unsure whether or not she has been, given something, or whether this is just a normal byproduct of the fact that her kind of dreams have become much more terrifying of late. I do want to just make a quick comment on like the visual and editing aspect here. It's really cool to see the overlay of both what was really happening in reality and also the overlay of what Ellie was seeing, flashes from the past to the present in the same space. And that is throughout the movie. And I think it's really well done and bizarrely like not whimsical, but very, very striking. John kind of makes a move on Ellie, or they kind of make a move on each other, and they decide to go back to Ellie's place, to have sex. But important to note that Ellie's not supposed to bring guys back, so she's like, we have to be quiet. And then they proceed to be extremely unquiet, climbing the stairs up to Ellie's room. And they start to make out, and then Ellie has another flashback. And this is the most like violent kind of into the past that she's gone. It's Jack holding Sandy at knife point, threatening her.
In the bed that they are currently in.
Yeah, in the bed that they are currently in. And the visual aspect of this is really striking as well, where Ellie looks up at the ceiling and it is Sandy and Jack reflected back down onto them in a mirror image, literally, of the position she is in with John in the bed. So she starts to freak out. John stops making out with her and is like, what's wrong? She's obviously like not even seeing him anymore. She is just seeing Jack threatening Sandy at knife point. And this basically escalates to Jack stabbing Sandy to death in an extremely violent sequence with a lot of blood, very close shots on the knife, very dramatic. At some point during this, the old woman who is the landlady comes up and kicks John out. He stumbles back and hits a mirror in the room, causing a bunch of broken glass to land on the floor, and he basically runs out. The landlady doesn't really engage in a conversation with Ellie, who is just coming out of the vision she's just seen. She merely just says, "We'll talk about this tomorrow." And Ellie is left terrified and alone in the bedroom.
She also does ask if Ellie's okay. It's clear she believes that there was some sort of sexual assault that just happened. And this is not surprising to her.
Yeah, this is an important detail for later. Yeah, she does stop to ask Ellie if she's okay and then says that, like, they will talk about it tomorrow. And she also doesn't seem especially mad, which I do think is important to note. She's very gentle about the fact that basically Ellie broke basically the one rule that she kind of had for her. Basically, the next day, Ellie is at the studio, and we've seen in previous scenes in the movie, Ellie has started to come to hate the project that she's working on in her fashion class. So she's been basically making up one of the dresses that she'd seen from a dream that Sandy was wearing, the very first dress she saw Sandy wearing. And throughout the course of the movie and up until this point, we have seen her start to grow to hate this piece. She is revolted by it at this point because she's seen all that has happened to Sandy. She is having a student try on the dress. She's trying to make trimmings to it, changes to it, and she sees Sandy bloodied and stabbed looking back at her. And she runs from the classroom screaming, basically, leaves all her things behind and decides that she must solve Sandy's murder. That becomes her prime motivation at this point in the story. She goes to the library and starts looking through old records of killings. This is an important detail. I believe the clippings that she looks at of murders do not show murdered women. I do think they show like murdered men, which is an important detail for later. John visits her in the library with her things. He is very kind to her, tries to see if she's okay. She basically tells him somewhat the truth. She's basically like, "I saw this murder in the bed." And he is like, "I'll help you figure it out." He walks away.
He's also increasingly spooked.
Yeah, he is. He's the fact that he didn't just be like, "Okay, that was good talk, goodbye," is like kind of crazy to me. But hey, the things you'll do. I think the fact that John like really trusts her and like kind of believes her almost in a way in that moment is an interesting contrast, considering that only like moments before she went to school, and we have that scene where Ellie has that flashback with Sandy in the dress, Ellie actually goes to the police station to try and report the murder, even though, you know, she is many years too late. She sits down with two officers, explains to them what has happened. They obviously don't believe her. They think she, you know, is mentally unwell. The female police officer, you know, tries to offer some kind of support, ask her about her personal life, try and see if there's anything she can do for her, whereas the male police officer is shown kind of laughing her off. I think this is an important thing as well to note. There are many scenes where Ellie makes direct eye contact with a woman, either in like a memory or in the modern day, and there is a silent communication given by that woman that implies, you know, get out of the situation, or I'm listening, or things like that. Just a sort of, you're shown that they know something in a way that the male characters do not. The male characters are often portrayed as potential predators to like Ellie's point of view. They are seen as threatening. With the sole exception of John, who is a very sweet person. I actually wrote in my notes, what a nice person, what a nice lad, I think was my exact note at this point in the movie, because I had like a running commentary of notes. So kind of bouncing back to where we are in the library, Ellie is continuing to do this research. She thinks John has come back to report that he's gotten like the next year's worth of newspapers pulled, when it turns out that it's actually Jack, I believe, or I don't think it's Jack. I think it's just one of the shadowy figures from Sandy's past that has been haunting Ellie. Again, all of these men are often shown in various states of undress. Their faces are completely obscured. They're like ghosts sort of tracking after her in, you know. They're incredibly shadowy. Yeah, it's very disturbing imagery. And they chase her through the library, and she has been coming apart at the seams pretty consistently up until this moment. So when she grabs her fabric scissors that she has in her things that John had brought to her and turns and tries to stab one of the figures, she is suddenly brought back to the present by John catching her arm just in time, just before she stabs a classmate who is the bully classmate from earlier. But important to note that Ellie did almost just stab another student who runs away screaming, and John tries to, de-escalate the situation, telling Ellie to stay there. He runs after the student, but of course Ellie is not going to wait. She leaves the library, and this is where she tries to go and confront Jack. At this point, she feels like she has no other option. The police haven't listened to her. The library has kind of, come up into a bust. So she goes to the bar, and she's told by her boss, "You have a visitor." She goes downstairs to find that it is the silver-haired man who she believes is Jack. Ellie tries to confront Jack. She has her recording set up on her iPhone, or smartphone rather, to listen to the conversation that she's having with him. She basically outright accuses him of killing Sandy just right there in the pub. He is confused. He says that he doesn't want to participate in the conversation. He does make it clear that he knows Sandy and that Sandy has been killed in a way, but he stands up to leave, and he says something along the lines of we're given the impression from him that a man named Alex has killed off Sandy. It was not him. Ellie pursues him into the street. They have a somewhat shouting confrontation where he is, because he stopped in the middle of the street to have this conversation with her, is hit by a car. It is then revealed by Ellie's boss, who runs out and says, "Oh, he was a police officer." Ellie realizes that this is in fact not Jack. This is a police officer who we met very briefly in one of the dream sequences where Sandy has a conversation with an officer.
Not just a police officer, but a vice officer.
Yeah, a vice officer who is interestingly a character who also has a perception beyond what you would expect a normal person to have a perception of, if that makes sense. In the dream flashback that Ellie has when he's talking to Sandy, he says, "You could be more than this. You shouldn't be here. You should go out and live your life." And he has a somewhat similar kind of ability to see past people that you sort of get from his interactions with Ellie. There's more happening there in his conversations with her, where he's recognizing her. Initially, you as the viewer see it as him kind of being a menacing force. You see him as Jack, but when it's revealed that he's actually not Jack, it actually does sort of make sense that he is this other very perceptive character who has been moving through this story parallel to Ellie in a lot of ways. Ellie then runs away again. There's a lot of running in the rain here. It's London. She basically is I have to get out of here. I have to get away. She calls her grandmother to tell her that she can't be another night here. She must come home. And her grandmother's, obviously, who's been calling her throughout the movie, trying to reach out, trying to help. And her grandmother's obviously I'm going to try and get down there as quickly as possible. I'll get someone to drive me down tonight. And then Ellie sees John in the street and just leaves the phone booth with her grandmother literally hanging, the phone hanging, and then goes after John for help. It's revealed that John has a car and he will drive her to Cornwall that night. This was the point where I out loud said, "Wow, I just wish they'd gotten in the car and driven away."
Right?
I was like,
who needs to resolve this? Just get out of there.
I was like, you don't need that record player, girl. Just, you can buy a new record player. Those clothes are replaceable. It's fine. You literally had one suitcase worth. But no, they go back to the house to get her things, because obviously at this point she does not know what we come to learn in the next few minutes, which is that Ellie arrives. She tells John to stay in the car because she doesn't want the landlady getting upset. And Ellie tells him that if I'm not back in 15 minutes, come check on me. She goes into the house and intends to have a sit-down conversation with the landlady to let her know that she will in fact be breaking her lease, which is something that was mentioned earlier in the film. The landlady had expressed a lot of frustration that people kept breaking the lease on the house. Her landlady offers her a cup of tea and says to her that she had accidentally picked up some of Ellie's mail for her to go through it. Ellie picks up the mail, and this is an important visual clue as to what we're about to find out, which is that the mail is all labeled or addressed to a Miss Alexandra. It was mentioned and revealed earlier in the movie that Sandy is short for Alexandra. There's a sequence in the movie basically where Ellie is dreaming of the endless sequence of men that Sandy engages with, and how they all say the same line over and over again, which is something along the lines of "what a lovely name." And Sandy is shown giving various iterations, shortenings, nicknames of Alexandra. She goes by Sandy herself, but in a way it shows how she didn't matter. She could have had any name and it wouldn't have mattered to these men. And it also shows how repetitive and how they're all sort of this one monolith, this one menacing monolith that threatens her throughout this movie.
It also shows that they're interested in the idea of a stage name and her persona within the club, not who she actually is.
Yeah. And so this is an important moment to hearken back to because the name on the mail says Alexandra, and that's when the things start to fall into place for the viewer, but not really for Ellie. The landlady offers her tea, plies her with it, in fact, and then Ellie tells her that she's going to break her lease. And then her landlady says she understood that, London was not all what she'd expected it to be, and mentions that the police had stopped by earlier to check in on Ellie's living situation. Ellie starts to get a sense that something is wrong and apologizes for any trouble caused by the police officer. Her landlady is like, it's okay, don't worry about it.
And they all left and everything was happily ever after.
If only. So basically what happens next is Ellie comes to learn in this conversation that she's actually Sandy, which is shocking for many reasons for Ellie, because A, she thought Sandy was dead, and B, turns out that Sandy is a serial killer who, when in fact it was not Jack who killed Sandy, rather it was Sandy who killed Jack. And then she went and killed all of the men that she had been forced to have sex with over the course of her time under Jack's control.
She actually goes so far as to say, in many ways, she did die because of having to sleep with all of the Johns throughout her time. So that's an interesting correlation there. Sandy had a vision of her dying, but in many ways, that bed was a place where she died. Or that iteration of Sandy with all of her dreams and aspirations died.
Yeah, and also Sandy's individuality is stripped throughout the movie as she is forced into a life of prostitution, as she's forced into a life of prostitution. Her identity, her individuality is stripped away bit by bit. And so at the end of the day, Sandy has died effectively by the time that we get to where she kills Jack. She kills all of these other men, which ties back to making sense with the fact that the newspaper articles were reporting serial killings of men from this time period, but not really of women.
And that Ellie is having visions of men.
Yeah, and Ellie's been having visions of dead men, which ties back to the fact that Ellie sees dead people, right? She's seen her dead mother all this time. It makes sense then that she has been seeing all of these dead men haunting her steps and not just Sandy. We then realize, shock, plot twist, the tea was poisoned. Gets them every time. Don't drink tea that people give to you. Be suspicious of everything. That's the real takeaway of this movie.
In many ways, this film repeatedly reinforces how poor drink safety is treated.
Indeed. So basically, Sandy's like, I won't stab you to death. I'll just have you lie down. You'll go to sleep and it'll be nice and whatever. And she starts like fluffing the pillows for Ellie, which is like, that is actually terrifying. And then the doorbell rings. John's still there, like the best boy that he is. He's come to check on her.
Ellie had said that she was alone as well, which puts Sandy in a place of surprise.
Yeah, suddenly the tone shifts and Sandy grabs a large knife that has been sitting nearby. It was with a cake with some food. It wasn't just, there. And leaves to go stab John to death. Ellie, horrified by this, manages to drag herself up. In doing so, she knocks over a cigarette from earlier that Sandy had been smoking, and she drops it onto the records. I do think it's very interesting that she drops it onto these 60s records that Sandy has pulled out to relive her old glory days.
Very specifically also the album that has the song that was her audition song.
And then what happens when a lit cigarette falls into paper? It catches on fire. But I'm jumping ahead here. We get to the door. Ellie sees Sandy answer it and stab John. Ellie tries to intervene and basically results in a very intense sequence, which is also I also found a very like visually beautiful part of the movie, which is where we go from seeing Ellie in the modern day crawling up the stairs being chased by old Sandy. We see it interposed with Ellie and Sandy on these eternal, beautiful, like glass steps almost. And it's young Sandy with her knife and she's singing to Ellie and she's more creepy, but it's just...
They're in a state of glamour.
Yeah, they're in a state of glamour interposed with, the fact that like the house is on fire and the physical aspects of Sandy's life are just burning away beneath them as they're going up this stair. Eventually, Ellie manages to kick Sandy back and runs into the room. and she is dragged down by the hands of these dead men. And it's revealed that they have been sort of trying to communicate with her. One of them finally manages to say, "Help me," and even offers her the phone that she's been trying to reach for when she got dragged down. Sandy breaks into the room, and the house is like very comfortably on fire at this point. And I will interject to say that the fact that no one was coughing and hacking and choking,
or unable to see,
that this was a lot of fire and not a lot of smoke. So everybody was able to stand upright and have a full conversation while the walls were on fire. I was like, couldn't be real life. The police have arrived. You can hear that there are firefighters outside. Things are coming to a head. Sandy decides that she is going to end her own life because she doesn't want to go to jail. That's not how her story ends for herself. Ellie tries to save her. Ellie feels this very deep connection to Sandy because she has seen Sandy's life and in some ways lived as Sandy. But Sandy does not let her be saved. She pushes Ellie out and sends her to go rescue John. Ellie, crawls down the stairs, leaving Sandy to burn in that room where she, in a way, died before. She's left to die again. And then they are pulled from the house, taken away. And then we kind of cut to like a happy ever after kind of ending where it's like her end of year fashion show. And she's got these models in clearly 60s inspired dresses inspired by Sandy's own costuming, doing a runway for her final. John's there, hunky-dory, not the worst for wear.
Clearly now a romantic interest.
Not dead.
Her grandmother's also there.
Everybody's happy to see her. And she has a very successful end of year show. At least I believe that's what she's having. And she's in the back room chatting with her family when she sees in the mirror. You see Sandy's mom when she kind of first arrives from the runway, and then she turns again and she sees that it's Sandy. And the last kind of part of the movie is she walks up and kind of taps the glass in a very friendly and playful manner, implying that she and Sandy are, on good terms, so to speak. Her mother smiles at her. Sandy blows her a kiss. We cut to the end of the movie. It took wild turns, this one.
What a messy third act.
Things really do unravel both for the main character and for the film's plot itself. I mean this in the nicest way I possibly can.
Edgar Wright has a lot to say, but he doesn't have nearly enough to say.
I loved the first part of this movie. The visual aspects of this were...
Oh, it's dazzling.
Gorgeous.
It's dazzling.
It's so glamorous. I love, you really do fall in love alongside Ellie with the 60s fashions and glamours and what we often as a society idealize the 60s to be. And I do think there's a lot of interesting takeaways to be pulled from the disturbing, darker aspects of that time period and the advantage, how Sandy's taken advantage of and things like that.
The misogyny that just permeates the culture.
The misogyny and the damage and the darkness that is underneath the dazzling and the glamour is an interesting theme to draw. But what leaves me confused at the end of the movie is how it goes from being this absolute tragedy about this young actress who wanted to make it big and is forced into, an exploitative situation like in Psycho and in talking again, going back to voyeurism, exploitation, sex, things like that. She is being taken advantage of in this situation, but then it turns it on its head at the last minute and it actually is like a rapist revenge kind of thing. But we're not left sure who to sympathize with, I feel like, as a viewer.
If anything, at both sides, and we're supposed to feel sympathetic for both the Johns and Sandy, which is a mess. It's very muddled, and it just feels like Wright didn't fully think out the implications of the morality tale that he's playing with.
I feel like it's one of those things where for the sake of a twist or a last minute turnaround, the story itself loses a lot of the more interesting societal commentary that it could have had.
Oh yeah, it's very simple at the end, and you keep thinking there's more to it, but there's not. We really end with the victim being the villain and the other victims, the victims of murder, being also villains. So everyone sucks. So we don't have any kind of positive conclusion. There's no real judgment on the rapists in how their plight is framed at the end. So we don't really know what to say.
Yeah, and the rapists, yeah, there's no like judgment placed on them. They are just shown to be just part of the system, so to speak, and aren't assigned any kind of guilt or anything. And I'm not saying that, you know, murder is justified for those reasons, but the way the film frames these men is that they go from being framed as these understandably menacing, terrifying figures to being victims. It just doesn't sit great considering all that they have done to Sandy.
Also, the way it paints these men, I think just the idea of men being a threat is a core theme of this film. And we don't really get a good glimpse into how active the Johns are in Sandy being trafficked. We don't know that they have an affirmative knowledge that this is what is happening here. So it just gets very, very messy. There's a number of points throughout this story. When we were talking before recording, you brought up the politics of having a black man caught in a white girl's bed as she's screaming in terror. The film touches on a lot of social ideas and doesn't seem to know what to do with it or really be interested in exploring them.
Yeah, like it brings up so many different ideas that would be very interesting either to think about, like, you know, a societal reflection or a deeper, more nuanced take on like the fact that this movie does pay a lot of homage to Peeping Tom and things like that. But the thing is like, it's just not as good like as the thing is it's homaging. It reaches for, this is what frustrates me about this movie, because I liked so much of it. I liked it right up until like the last 20 minutes.
Same. I've seen it 4 times. I think it's incredible. It reaches until the end.
For this amazing, in my opinion, really cool inversion of like the voyeuristic sexual slasher that we see in both Psycho and in Peeping Tom. Like, the women are victims in all 3 of these movies, but in Peeping Tom and in Psycho, we never really get the female quote-unquote perspective of it, what it is to be a woman and what it is to be a woman in danger.
Psycho touches on it for one scene only, and it's that scene of eating with Norman.
Yeah.
And we can really feel the power dynamics. This film is 100 minutes of that.
Yeah, this film is like one very long study in power dynamics. So I think it does a really good job of like turning and in like doing an inverse of what Psycho and Peeping Tom have and what many other like slashers, the themes of women being victims and things like that. I think this movie, like Last Night in Soho, it builds up to both invert and subvert your expectations of, you know, considering what other films have predated this movie in the genre. And instead, you sort of end up with Sandy, who is, again, up until this point, been this, you know, really tragic portrayal of like the terror that comes with being like a woman and the terror that comes with existence as a victim throughout the movie. It turns out, and in Psycho, she's actually the killer. It doesn't feel like an earned or interesting twist. It just sort of feels like a twist that is there to be a final twist in the movie and to have it explain it all away. And so it goes from being super duper interesting to being like, well, I guess she killed them. Like, what does that say? Nothing good, I don't think. Sorry if that's I'm stomping on anybody's rose bushes here.
And I don't think that movies are required to give us a satisfactory ending or to be morally neat, but it just feels so ham-fisted.
It feels like it's reaching for that and then doesn't.
There are rape revenge movies that do the same thing, where we see horrible, horrible violence inflicted on rapists. And we don't, and we're left with a message. We're left with feeling something. We're left with complicated thoughts. I don't have complicated thoughts here. I don't know what to think.
Yeah, it's like, I think in other like rapist revenge stories, it has a lot to do with power dynamics and power shifting. This doesn't feel like a power shift. It doesn't feel like a reclamation of power for Sandy to kill these men. It just sort of feels like here, let's explain away the final twist of the movie.
Yeah, she got out of her circumstance, but then she didn't do anything to stop it for other people.
Yeah, like there's
other than killing them.
There's there's no real power change. So I feel like even then it kind of fails as like a rapist revenge that it sort of introduces itself as in the last few minutes of the movie. My other big quibble, which is like, it feels nitpicky, but I feel like I need to say it, is the fact this movie just sort of hand waves things away that don't make sense. Ellie is drugged, but then is able to, you know, fight away a person, run up the stairs, pull away a knife, do all these things.
Adrenaline's a hell of a drug, but
Adrenaline's a hell of a drug. But when you have massive smoke inhalation and you've had like the various things that have happened to her over the course of that day, I find that hard to believe. The fact that they can have full conversations in a house that is literally on fire, like I believe just pulled me out of the moment. Even little like things like the fact that she does physically assault a fellow classmate with scissors in a library with multiple witnesses, and no one seems to have a consequence for it.
To be fair, she ran from that scene, and we don't really have further immediate aftermath at the school. We don't know how that was handled through student discipline because we jumped several months.
We do jump several months. I just feel like if it's something that was shown on screen, there should be at least a little bit more
of a hint,
yeah. An explanation, something, because otherwise you're kind of left with being like, well, what was important that I was shown?
Just like Sandy, Ellie has wronged people who are ostensibly terrible people. Her roommate is posh and condescending and callous and not considerate and horrible throughout the entire movie. But she doesn't deserve an attempted assault, you know?
Yeah, and that's an interesting parallel to draw how Ellie's and Sandy's lives do sort of mirror one another's in the most general sense, which is that you come to London with these dreams about your future, being an artist, being a performer, being a fashion designer, and you come to find that it is not what you have expected, and the people are not what you expect. They're not benevolent people who are going to help you along. They are, in many cases, people who, in Sandy's case, are truly dangerous, and in Ellie's case, at least malicious. One point I do really want to draw back to with Last Night in Soho is the voyeurism angle again, because Ellie is very much a voyeur in Sandy's life, which I thought was very interesting. In the first two movies, again, like Psycho and Peeping Tom, it's the men who are the voyeurs. But in this movie, Last Night in Soho, it's Ellie who's the voyeur, which again, this is why this movie frustrates me so much, in that it feels like it's going to be a great subversion of like movies like Psycho and Peeping Tom. And then again, like we've just said before, it doesn't deliver.
The one interesting thing is she is unable to express her shock, her need to intervene, because she is trapped in the mirror, essentially, which we can connect with as viewers because we are seeing the same things and reacting the same way. So that's an interesting experience.
It is. And the fact that Ellie is a unable to interfere observer throughout the sequences of these like dreams or flashbacks, whatever you want to call them, that she has, I thought was really an interesting angle to take with the voyeurism side of things. Because at the same time, she also wants to take on qualities of Sandy. She envies Sandy. She has all these desires attached to Sandy in a lot of ways, in a way that, you know, a voyeur in the first two movies may have towards, you know, not in the same way, but like there is a desire and there is a want in all of these aspects.
She's also detached in her perspective, so she's able to see that Sandy is over her head before Sandy, I think, has come to terms with that. So that's an interesting angle. All of these films deal with the idea of notoriety and celebrity as a angle for voyeurism in interesting ways. And Last Night in Soho really is narrowing in on something that I think our generations deal with a lot, which is obsession with the past. You know, we idolize the past in ways that is unhealthy and not accurate. In Peeping Tom, we're talking about sexual icons. In Psycho, we're talking about mostly financial icons, you know, success, class. Here we're talking about living in a different era without confronting and addressing the problems of the era, and how we build up idols out of other eras without having the experiences of the era.
Yeah, I think even though like Psycho and Peeping Tom are like made in the 60s, they do in so many directly ways like just call out things that were, you know, popular desires and wants and values of the day, so to speak. But also like we as a viewer in 2023 can look back at that and see that the movie calls out the glamorizing of these things as well in a lot of ways, if that makes sense. Because they're products of the 60s, but they're like showing the darker sides of a time that we revere.
And Last Night in Soho uses the music of the 60s, uses the glamour of the wardrobe and the iconic locations in London. And it is so vivid and so tangibly exaggerated in how it's portrayed. It is perfect at first. It really reminds me of Giallo cinema, which is an Italian movement from the mid-70s mostly, where you have this intensely lurid, vibrant spaces that are kind of torn away to reveal darkness. And we get that consistently throughout here as Sandy's idealized world turns into a nightmare. So I think that's another influence. The Peeping Tom references are very on the nose throughout this movie, but there's also clearly a lot taken here from Dario Argento and in films like Suspiria.
Yeah, and I think Last Night in Soho pulls in those influences, and I genuinely think it's trying to say something. I'm just a little bit, I'm left a little bit confused about what it was supposed to be. I think that one interesting aspect to think about Last Night in Soho, because it did come out in 2021, which is very recent. It's just a couple years ago for us. We do live in an era, like you mentioned earlier, we're obsessed with the past. Nostalgia is a very powerful thing. Like, it's always been powerful, but I think like we have a very glamorized, very specific kind of nostalgia in 2023 that we have for the 80s, we have for the 60s, we have for the 50s. And again, I think Last Night in Soho starts to do an interesting peel back of the corners and an interesting interrogation of that nostalgia. But because it's a thriller and because it's one movie and doesn't have space for all of that, it kind of just starts to peel back those layers and then just sort of lets them be. So I really love a lot of the concepts that are opened up in Last Night in Soho, and a lot of the concepts that I start to think about when talking about Last Night in Soho, but I'm also frustrated with the end of the movie because it doesn't ever sort of finish what anything it started. It's pulled back some boards, pulled back some nails, and then it just sort of has left everything and been like, okay, end of movie. Go. And
for all of the questionable choices there in direction, Wright does get absolutely incredible performances out of Thomasin McKenzie, out of Anya Taylor-Joy, out of Matt Smith, who is downright menacing while being charming as hell.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And then you have Diana Rigg, who, chef's kiss, what a loss. But what a movie to go out on. Her performance is riveting. She carries the screen at every moment she's on screen. We haven't really talked enough, I feel like, about the acting performances in any of these movies, but acting is great in all of these, but really stands out to me in Last Night in Soho. Maybe that's because I'm more familiar with these actors and I've seen them in other things, but I found myself taken aback, especially by Matt Smith's performance as someone who became familiar with him through like Doctor Who, which is not at all a menacing role. I was really impressed with the performances in this. And so I feel like you and I sound like we really dislike this movie, but I think we both enjoy engaging with the concepts of this movies. I will repeat, 4 times. I have watched this movie 4 times. And I will be watching it again. Twice in cinema. There's a lot interesting happening in this movie, even if we're left a little out in the cold at the end. I think there's a lot of really cool things about this movie that I really liked as well. Well, that about wraps it up for us this week. Please make sure that you leave a 5-star review on your podcatcher of choice. In our next episode, we will be going to a little bit of a lighter fare. We'll be exploring the musicals of Jacques Demy with The Umbrellas of Cherbourg and The Young Girls of Rochefort, and then tying in how Demy moved away from the traditional on-stage musical to using locations in a very fresh way compared to American musicals of his era. And then we're going to compare that to Damien Chazelle's La La Land and how that uses those on-set locations and spontaneity to revive the genre. Until then, track down a copy of Peeping Tom to watch. As well, happy Halloween to you, Kyle. Happy Halloween.